this is a talk that I gave at the Canadian Game Studies Association in 2017. Before I gave this talk, for months I was promising people I would record it. I promised so many people I would record this talk. I went up to give the talk and I was just so nervous, like even more nervous than normal. I'm also nervous making this video. And I had my camera with me, I had my tripod with me, I had everything, and I just totally forgot. I am reading this talk, so if it seems like I'm not looking in the camera as much as possible, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get the wording right, basically. So this is an unlisted video that I'm sharing with people who didn't get to see my talk at CGSA 2017. If you feel like there's someone you know who I don't know, who you feel like could really use this talk, who really needs this talk, please send it to them. The reason this talk is unlisted will become very obvious as I give it. Feel free to cite this talk. I would suggest just not sharing it publicly on your social media channels. So 5 years ago, I just started my PhD and I wasn't studying games, which was kind of strange because all my friends were. I wasn't studying games because I didn't want to be part of game studies. And frankly, I didn't want to be part of game studies because it was just scarier to me than other fields, even though I knew way more about games than I did about anything else that I was studying. I just didn't think I was enough of a gamer to be part of game studies. Luckily, over the course of 3.5 years, many people pushed me to participate in game studies, especially the original editors of First Person Scholar. They pushed me to join First Person Scholar, they pushed me to participate in First Person Scholar culture, and they pushed me to publish my writing about games on First Person Scholar. Eventually, they convinced me to join First Person Scholar, and Steve even convinced me to take over as editor-in-chief. It was only when I became editor-in-chief of First Person Scholar that I felt comfortable enough to become part of game studies and consider myself a game scholar and to fully switch all my research into the area of game studies. But this almost didn't happen. For every event that pulled me into game studies, there were 1,000 that pushed me out. For so long, I swore up and down that I would never join game studies. But I did, and while I was at First Person Scholar, I was in the unique position of having sort of my ear to the ground of game studies while simultaneously having a type of bird's eye view of the field. There's one thing I learned in my time as editor-in-chief of FPS. It was that the many men who submitted to us felt confident and self-assured about their opinions on games in a way that the few women who submitted to us never did. The men had a wealth of positive experiences in games culture that taught them that they were experts. It's the same reason why if you are a woman who's ever taught a game studies class, your male students think that they are they know so much more about games than you, despite the fact that you have a literal PhD in video games. It's the same reason. No matter how much we know, men come into game studies feeling like experts, and women come in already feeling like outsiders. You may be thinking, oh, she's too young to be giving one of these meta talks about game studies. She doesn't have enough experience or something like that. But I think this is actually one of those problems that needs someone exactly like me to address it. Someone who's young, who hasn't spent that much time in game studies, someone who's on their way out of game studies in academia, and most importantly, someone who's just recently felt how hard it is to claw your way into game studies just in time to claw your way out. I feel like we need people who are in this liminal position that I'm in to talk about these issues. People who don't necessarily have something to lose, but who care deeply about the success and diversity of game studies as a discipline. All of this leads me to say that game studies is a field that is substantially easier for men, and specifically white men, to traverse than women and non-binary people. And yes, this is true of many fields, but there is something unique about game studies, just like there's something unique about the games industry. We spent a lot of time talking about the leaky pipeline between childhood gaming habits, education, and the games industry. I don't hear people spending as much time talking about the leaky pipeline between childhood gaming habits, education, and game studies. What about the pipeline for women into tenure-track jobs in game studies? Essentially, what I'm asking is, how can we make game studies a refuge from, instead of an extension of, the toxic reality of games culture? So to shift gears a little bit, In 2015, my friend and colleague Elise Vist published an article on First Person Scholar in which she explains why she left game studies for the field of fan studies. She explains that she doesn't call herself a game scholar for the same reason she doesn't call herself a gamer. It's easier to just not have to prove it. She goes on to explain that as she met more and more game scholars, she started to feel like she wasn't studying game studies correctly. Like Elise, I noticed the obsessive presence of the gamer identity within game studies, and it never quite let me feel like I was enough. For a long time, I felt totally unqualified to even discuss gender in games with my male colleagues, simply because I hadn't played as many games with female protagonists as they had. Even the conversations that were about me never felt like they were for me. In other words, I would constantly feel the imposter syndrome of academia colliding with the imposter syndrome of games culture to create a cocktail of constant self-doubt. I found myself constantly thinking, am I enough of a gamer to be part of game studies? Now this is the part where I've made charts. God help us all. What happens when we encounter a culture that expects you to exhibit traditional academic capital as well as traditional gamer capital? What happens when the white male-dominated world of academia collides with the white male-dominated world of games culture? Well, that's game studies. Within game studies, I've heard the research of many women, including my own, referred to as not really game studies. Sometimes it's because the texts being studied are not really games, or sometimes it's because the work examines games discourse and games culture instead of gameplay or the games themselves. As long as I've been aware that game studies was a thing, there has been this discourse about what game studies is and what game studies isn't. And it has caused myself and others to feel like we are on the outside of the discipline looking in. And this brings me to my next topic. Feel free to groan, you're sitting at home, let it all out, no one has to hear you. We all want this debate to be over, right? But yet it is at the very center of how game studies is taught to grad students. For my comprehensive exams, I had to read texts on both sides of this debate in an attempt to understand it. But when I was reading these texts, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. No, scratch that. When I was reading these texts for my comprehensive exams, it didn't make any sense at all. Furthermore, I couldn't help but feel like the whole thing was extremely gendered, that the narratology side of the debate seemed intensely feminized as emotional or as artsy-fartsy, whereas the ludology side of the debate was held up as logical and scientific. Luckily for me, while desperately Googling, I think it was, who called themselves a narratologist, I found Janet Murray's brilliant 2005 talk entitled The Last Word on Ludology versus Narratology. In this essay, Murray forecasted my exact confusion as a graduate student. She said, quote, "The students flooding our graduate and undergraduate programs should not continue to be confused by the appearance of an either-or choice between games and stories." End quote. In this talk, Murray explains that there were in fact no self-declared narratologists at the time, and the term was just a straw man created by the self-declared ludologists. And she explained that the term narratology was being used to describe the research of anyone who discussed games as, quote, cultural, dramatic, narrative, psychological, emotional, or in any manner that is not ludology. This for me filled in so many blanks. It made me understand why so many people thought that the research that I was interested in or that my friends were interested in was not really game studies. Many people were, without even knowing it, pushing aside this research that fell under this umbrella of narratology as less than, as less important, as less rigorous. Murray concluded her talk by explaining that, quote, "The ludology versus narratology argument can never be resolved because one group of people is defining both sides of it. The ludologists are debating a phantom of their own creation." This was, for me, one of the single most important things I ever read during my PhD. It helped so many things fall into place for me, and it's still helping me understand the culture of game studies today. So a lot has changed since 2005, but like Murray predicted, the debate can't be resolved. Most recently, Ian Bogost declared in a 2017 Atlantic piece that games are, quote, better without stories, causing the Ludology-Narratology debate to play out in a way that I have never seen an academic debate play out online. It was happening on Twitter, it was happening on Facebook, it was happening in my direct messages, and so many of the people who were participating in this debate were participating in it for the first time. And if you know me at all, you know I am such an advocate of bringing academic discourse, academic concepts, academic debates to the public, but this is the literal one thing I wish could have been left in the ivory tower. In this article, not only did Bogost not make mention to Murray's last words on the topic, but he also made continued passing reference to her work Hamlet on the Holodeck without citing her or mentioning her name at any point. It's also worth noting that the whole reason that Janet Murray posted her 2005 words online in 2013 was because of an image that Bogost had photoshopped of Janet Murray boxing Espen Arseth that was, according to Murray, being heavily circulated at the time in 2013, making her feel like she had to put the talk online to point out again that the debate was one-sided. And then just a few weeks ago, after Bogost's newest article, Murray posted an excerpt from her re-released and updated version of Hamlet on the Holodeck on First Person Scholar as a clapback to Bogost's most recent article. Again, she is dragged back into the boxing ring, and again, she simply reiterates her existing work. What a legend. So the point of all this is that while many of us remain uninterested in having this debate, there are many male game scholars who seem very interested in having it and continue to, oh so subtly, force women to have the debate with them. So I guess the question is why? And I think the answer is that for some there is an appeal in these debates, especially for men and especially for young men who are trying to establish themselves in academia for the first time. I've been in many a conference and seminar where I've had to listen to male grad students gleefully reenact the Ludology-Narratology debate in the same way that teenage boys everywhere will debate Marvel or DC, Star Wars, Star Trek, the Beatles or the Stones. There seems to be an inherent masculine desire in reiterating these debates and you displaying that you have this full grasp of them, which is ironic because by participating in the debate, you're acknowledging that the debate really does exist when the debate really didn't exist. So if anything, you're just proving yourself kind of stupid. The brilliant Bianca Batti and Alisha Karabinus put this so much better than I ever could have in their recent essay on Bogost and epistemological gatekeeping on Not Your Mama's Gamer. I'm going to put the link down below. You have to read it. They explain that in game studies there is in place, quote, a fantasy of male power that allows Bogost to believe himself the arbiter of truth and knowledge in games. The male power fantasy inherent in believing oneself to be the judge of what is good and right in games, what makes certain games better than others. It's the kind of thing that results in these methods for gatekeeping in game studies. Not just whose games get to count as games, but whose study of them gets to count as legitimate and valid as well. End quote. Furthermore, as both Gerald Voorhees and Kevin Moberly have discussed, having this quote-unquote debate has allowed certain scholars to exercise a type of control over the field of game studies. As Moberly put it, the people participating in these debates can put themselves at the center of the discourse by deciding both what the playing field looks like as well as who is quote, allowed to enter the contest. It's these sorts of debates that lead us to believe that certain work within game studies isn't really game studies, and that also leads women like me to resist joining game studies as a discipline, and women like my colleague Elise Vist to leave it. Now you may be thinking at this point in the video, well, that's not my game studies, but it is a game studies that exists. It is a game studies that exists at our conferences, in our graduate programs, in our textbooks, and even in some of our journals. A few years back, my friend and colleague Steve Wilcox created this graphic. So this graphic visualizes 5 years worth of tags on gamestudies.org, where the larger the word, the more often it was tagged. Steve explains that this graphic doesn't just identify which topics receive the most critical attention, but it also reveals what terms are, quote, not present at all, such as feminism, misogyny, ableism, and racism, end quote. Looking at this graphic, it was no surprise that I was told and felt early on that my research wasn't really game studies. While there was other work like mine being done, it was being marginalized into a very specific subset of game studies. And that is feminist game studies. It's so lucky for me that influential feminist game scholars have done so much work to carve out a space for young grad students like myself within game studies. We are especially lucky in Canada, where Jennifer Jensen and Suzanne de Castel have headed up not only the Canadian Game Studies Association, but also the Feminist in Games Conference and the Refiguring Innovation in Games Feminist Game Studies Network, also known as ReFig. I know that these networks and the women in them have kept me from leaving not just game studies, but academia over and over and over again. It's the work that these women have done that in her essay, Elise Vist describes as clinging onto like lifeboats, and I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. Without the work that these women have done, especially in my case, the work of Adrienne Shaw, the work of Shira Chess, the work of Emma Westacott, the work of Kishona Gray, without these academics, I wouldn't have been able to write my dissertation, and I sure wouldn't have felt like my work was game studies. I feel the need to state that game studies still is male-dominated. I've had multiple people say to me that they feel that while there's more men in game studies, the most important voices are women, and I'm so happy that so many people feel that way. I do think without a doubt that some of the most important tenured voices in game studies are women. But what about the female grad students who are doing the research now? What's retaining them in game studies? I know next to zero women grad students in game studies who want to continue on to the academic path. And even those who want to have no guarantee of survival through that pipeline. I guess what I'm saying is I have no doubt that we can attract diverse individuals to game studies, but how do we retain them? How do we retain women? How do we retain non-binary people? How do we retain people of color into game studies when it continues to be dominated by white men? It continues to be white men who feel like they have the right to be here and to determine what game studies is. How do we retain diverse people in game studies when there are so few jobs for them? And when so many of those jobs are held by white men? How much of the diversity of this conference, CGSA 2017, is made up of grad students? So much of it. How many of those grad students are going to get tenure-track jobs? How do we build a better game studies when academia is giving us so little to work with? Well, to start, not only do we need all game studies to be feminist game studies, but as Adrienne Shaw recently argued in her keynote at UC Irvine, we need all game studies to be intersectional game studies. We need to all think about how our work is about race and class and ability and sexuality as well as gender. More so, to quote Shaw's talk directly, we need to take our professional spaces and not just make them inclusive, but also, quote, look critically at what has structurally made them so homogenous. I guess that's kind of what this talk is about. Thinking critically about what has made the space of game studies so homogenous. What are the structures that continue to enable this lack of diversity? Feminist intersectional politics is not just a tool for scholarship. It's a tool for building a better field, no matter the topic of your work. All game studies needs to be intersectional feminist game studies. So let's take Shaw's advice and look critically at what has made our field so homogenous. Let's talk about that by talking about the experiences of 3 women game scholars interacting with 3 male game scholars. This is a tweet from Ian Bogost where he expresses his dismay at the idea of a Minecraft camp for girls. I called him out on this, and he claimed that these things just weren't necessary. I argued that like 20 years of feminist game scholarship demonstrates that it probably is very necessary, and he disagreed. He called it segregation. I gave up and I unfollowed him. Here's a tweet where Sarah Ahmed explains that she called Bogost out for the fact that he barely ever cites women and people of color, and he actually argued that it was because of, quote, the traditions that have influenced him, end quote. Yes, that is right. He argued with Sarah fucking Ahmed. I can't believe it. I don't even think Sarah Ahmed has ever done any work in game studies, and Sarah Ahmed, fucking hero. Lastly, an established female game scholar talked to me about a conference that she attended when she was a grad student, where she got into a conversation with a male scholar about Bogost's newest book at the time. This man drunkenly argued with her until she walked away. Later that evening, he came back up to her. She assumed to apologize, but what he did instead was he reached out and tried to crush her hand and told her not to get so emotional in an intellectual argument. He now has a tenure-track job. I have countless more stories about men in game studies like this that I do not have the permission nor time to share. Feminist game studies, and specifically women in game studies, have a back channel of communication that allows us to survive game studies. And this back channel of communication includes everything from who not to play games with because they'll get irrationally angry when you beat them, to who is guilty of sexual assault. This is how we survive game studies. I tell all these stories to make a point about a sort of nerd bro culture that we are suffering through in game studies right now. And I know that you know what I'm talking about, because if there's one thing I hear every time I tell people that I'm writing part of my dissertation about game studies culture, it's this idea of the game studies bro. The last man I mentioned, the fist-crushing man, is what I've been calling for years a Bogost bro. Or, as my friend Elise maybe more eloquently calls them, a Bogost. Much like the Bernie bro, the Bogost bro has less to do with the man himself and a lot more to do with sort of fighting for what you think he represents at all costs. It's a type of extreme Bogost fan who is almost a sort of neo-ludologist, someone who you feel like could have easily become a gamergator in another life where they didn't get a PhD. The type of guy who feels like feminist game scholarship isn't relevant to his work, who loves playing devil's advocate, who probably thinks his opinions are objective, who can quote the oldest games theory from memory, who antagonizes Gamergate just for fun, or who will get irrationally angry when you say The Last of Us has shitty gameplay. As I learned at this conference after giving this talk, it may even be the type of guy who doesn't like Bogost, who tweets hashtag Gamergate into the conference hashtag even after being explicitly told not to. The conclusion all of this is that yes, Gamergate is without a doubt a threat to female game scholars. It is a threat to me, and it is without a doubt part of why I'm leaving. What is an even bigger threat to our continuation through the game studies pipeline is our colleagues, our committee members, our most prominent scholars. Not just the anti-feminist ones, but also the ones who see feminism as simply a tool, as a way of gaining tenure, of gaining clicks, of gaining citations, and not as a way of being in this world. I'm going to conclude this talk, or should I say this video, with a oversimplified but hopefully very powerful thought experiment. So just stay with me for 30 more seconds. When you join game studies as a young male game scholar, you could be Ian Bogost. You could study games and their procedures, and you can insist that stories are overrated, and you can insist that Gone Home is overrated despite it not being for you or anyone like you even a tiniest bit. You can refuse to cite women, and hell, you can even refuse to cite the foundational works of women at your own institution. Brilliant. You can have a cajillion Twitter followers, and you can get paid to write articles about not just games, but about women's bodies and shampoo bottles and fidget spinners and the McRib. And you can become one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful voice in all of game studies. You could be Ian fucking Bogost. Or you could be a woman in game studies. You could be a young woman who writes about games and gets her mentions flooded by Gamergate, even though you go out of your way to not mention them ever, ever, ever under any circumstances. Or if you're more like me, you could get the unique opportunity through your national news network to share your research with the entire country. It's really fucking exciting. But when I say the entire country, I also mean literal neo-Nazis who will make YouTube videos about you, and people will watch them, and they will leave comments like this. And like this, and like this, and like this, and like this, and if you're really lucky, even like this. It's glamorous, I know. You can do all of this and more as a woman in game studies, but you can't be in Bogost. Thank you.